It began as one of those missions no one talks about. The kind that doesn't make the news or get mentioned in papers, but the kind that sticks with you for the rest of your life, if you make it back at all. There were 6 of us, sent deep into the Sahara to investigate what had been described as an anomaly. Nothing serious, they said. Routine exploration, they assured us. But nothing about the situation felt routine. It never did. The desert stretched endlessly around us, a sea of sand that rippled under the blazing sun, offering no mercy from the heat or isolation. For miles there was nothing. No trees, no rocks, not even the hint of an animal. Just us and the vast emptiness. We'd been out there for 3 days, setting up camp and collecting data, trying to make sense of the strange readings we were getting from deep under the desert. It didn't match anything we knew. Magnetic fields were out of alignment. Temperatures fluctuated without explanation, and then there was the ground itself. It didn't behave the way it should have. It shifted too easily, as if the desert was alive, breathing beneath our feet. On the 3rd day, we found it. We hadn't expected to find anything at all, certainly not the structure that emerged from the sand like some long-forgotten ruin. At first glance, it didn't look like much. A dark stone slab, partially buried, almost indistinguishable from the dunes around it. But the longer we stared, the more we realized how wrong it was. The stone was too dark, a deep black that seemed to drink in the sunlight, casting no reflection. And it wasn't shaped like anything natural. It was too deliberate, too smooth. It looked ancient, older than any ruin we had ever encountered, and yet untouched by time or decay. The others gathered around it, silent at first. No one said a word. We just stood there, staring at the doorway carved into the center of the structure. It wasn't large, barely wide enough for a single person to pass through. But it called to us in a way that none of us could explain. I remember feeling a strange pull, like gravity itself was shifting, drawing me toward it. The air around us had grown still, unnaturally so. Even the wind, which had been relentless since we arrived, had died down, as if the entire desert was holding its breath. Marcus was the first to speak. "It's just a ruin," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch the smooth surface of the stone. "We've seen stuff like this before. Just older. Older." That word hung in the air, heavy with a weight none of us could shake. Older than what? Older than any civilization we knew. Older than anything we had expected to find. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was the feeling that came with it, the sense that we weren't supposed to be there, that the desert itself had hidden this place for a reason. "Let's document it," someone suggested, their voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake something sleeping beneath the sand. But no one moved. No one took out their equipment or started their analysis. We just stood there, staring at the doorway. There was something wrong with it, something that none of us could put into words, but we all felt. It was more than just the appearance of the structure. It was the way it made you feel, deep down in your gut, like you were standing on the edge of a cliff and something just out of sight was waiting to push you over. We should have left then. We should have packed up and walked away, documented the structure from a distance, and reported it as an anomaly. But we didn't. Curiosity, or maybe something else, got the better of us. And that's when we made the first mistake. We went inside. The doorway was narrow, and we had to enter one by one, moving slowly, as if our bodies resisted the pull of the darkness within. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the temperature dropped. It was sudden, like plunging into ice water. The air was dense, heavy, almost suffocating, and the smell. It wasn't something I recognized, but it clung to the back of my throat, sour and metallic, like the scent of old blood. It wasn't what I expected. There was no dust, no sand, just smooth, cold stone that stretched out into the darkness ahead. The walls were smooth, unnaturally so, like they had been carved by something far more advanced than we could imagine. No markings, no signs of human craftsmanship, just an eerie, sterile emptiness that pressed in on us from all sides. At first, no one spoke. We moved in silence, our footsteps echoing through the long, winding corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly before us. It was cold, colder than it had any right to be, considering the heat outside. My breath fogged in the air, and I could see the others, their faces tight with tension, their eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. The further we walked, the more the sense of wrongness grew. The walls seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them, curving in ways that didn't make sense. The passageway was straight, but if you glanced at it from the corner of your eye, you could see it bending, twisting like something alive. Every few feet, the ground under our feet seemed to hum, faint vibrations that ran up through your legs and into your bones. It wasn't until we reached the first chamber that we realized how deep we had gone. The doorway behind us was long gone, swallowed by the endless corridor, and yet no one had turned back. The room we found ourselves in was massive, far too large to fit within the structure we had seen from the outside. High ceilings arched overhead, vanishing into the shadows, and the walls, now curved inwards, were lined with strange symbols. Not writing, not art, but something else entirely. Something older than language, older than any human memory. I don't know who noticed it first, but the light had begun to change. It wasn't the flicker of a bulb or a flame, but a slow, deliberate dimming. The glow that had illuminated the room when we first entered had grown fainter, as if the very space itself was draining the light. We stood there staring at each other, waiting for someone to say something to make sense of what we were seeing. But no one spoke. No one moved. We were trapped in that moment. Frozen by the weight of what we had stumbled into, we stood there, frozen as the dimming light pressed down on us. The change was so gradual at first, we barely noticed it. But now, it was undeniable. The faint glow that had illuminated the chamber was fading, not like a flickering bulb, but like the life was being drained out of the very air. It was as if the room was swallowing the light, pulling it into the walls, into the ancient carvings that lined the stone. Each of us glanced around, hoping someone else had an explanation, but no one spoke. The silence was thick, too thick to break. We all felt it. That's when Marcus stepped forward, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the eerie quiet. "It's just the natural light," he muttered, trying to sound confident. "The walls are probably absorbing it somehow." His voice didn't convince any of us, least of all him. I could see it in his eyes. He was just as unnerved as the rest of us. The air felt heavier in here. It was as if the cold stillness of the place had a weight to it, pressing against your skin, making each breath a little harder. The smell of old, stale air mixed with that strange metallic tang that stuck to the back of my throat. It was subtle at first, but the further in we went, the stronger it became. My stomach churned, and I saw Sarah pull her jacket tighter around her, even though the cold was coming from inside, not out. John, our leader, finally spoke, his voice steady but low. "We need to document this." He pulled out his camera, but the flash barely cut through the dimming light. It cast strange, warped shadows on the walls, highlighting the ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with some hidden energy. We weren't supposed to be here. That thought kept repeating in my mind, even as I tried to shake it off. This place, this thing, had been hidden for a reason. The chamber stretched out further than it should have, the walls bending in a way that defied logic. The layout didn't make sense. No matter which way we turned, it felt like the room was stretching, growing. It was subtle, but you could feel it, like the distance between us and the far end of the chamber kept shifting. There was no wind, no draft, and yet the air felt like it was moving, alive somehow. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but it cut through the stillness like a knife. "This isn't right." No one disagreed, but no one moved either. Something held us there, something deeper than fear. Curiosity? Maybe. But it felt more like the room itself didn't want to let us go. That's when the noise started. It was faint at first, a low hum, barely noticeable over the sound of our own breathing. But it grew, slow and steady, like the vibration of machinery buried deep beneath the ground. Except there was no machinery, no equipment, just stone and silence. The sound echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. It felt like it was all around us, inside us, vibrating through the floor, through our bodies. We all heard it at the same time, and instinctively we moved closer together, forming a tight circle in the center of the room. John, always the calm one, turned slowly, his eyes scanning the walls, the ceiling, the floor, trying to locate the source of the sound. But there was nothing, no movement, no machinery, nothing that could explain the growing hum that seemed to resonate deep in our bones. "It's coming from the walls," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was right. The hum was coming from the stone itself, vibrating through the ancient carvings that lined the room, as if they were alive, as if they were reacting to our presence. No one wanted to say it, but we all felt it. The room was waking up. The hum grew louder, more insistent, like a distant engine revving to life. The walls seemed to pulse with it, the carvings shimmering in the fading light. And then the room changed. Not all at once, not in a way you could see directly, but we all felt it. The walls shifted subtly at first, just enough to make you doubt your senses. The floor seemed to stretch, elongating beneath our feet. The distance between us and the walls expanded, even though none of us had moved. "Are we moving?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. I wasn't sure how to answer. The whole room felt alive now, like it was stretching, expanding in ways that made no sense. The geometry was wrong. You could feel it, even if you couldn't see it. Every step we took, every turn of the head, the room seemed to adjust itself, like it was playing with us. "We need to go back," I said, my voice tight. "Now." John nodded, agreed. But when we turned back toward the entrance, the doorway was gone. There was no sign of where we had come from. The stone walls had closed behind us, seamless, as if the passage we had entered through had never existed. Panic rippled through the group. Sarah stepped forward, her hand frantically searching the stone, as if she could find the seam where the door had been. But there was nothing, just cold, smooth stone that stretched endlessly in every direction. "We didn't come this far," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "We weren't that deep in. The door should be right here." But it wasn't. It was gone. The hum grew louder, more insistent now, vibrating through the floor, through the air, through our bones. It was almost deafening. And the light was nearly gone, swallowed by the darkness that crept in from the corners of the room, pressing in around us. "We have to find another way out," John said, his voice calm but firm. He motioned for us to follow him deeper into the chamber, but every step felt wrong. Every movement we made seemed to stretch the space around us, pulling the room farther and farther away from where we had started. It was like the walls were bending, curving in ways that defied physics. We moved in silence, the hum still vibrating in the background, the air growing heavier with every step. And that's when I felt it. A presence, not something I could see, not something I could hear, but something that was there, watching us. I stopped, frozen, my heart racing in my chest. The others kept moving unaware, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. Something had woken up in that room, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. Marcus turned to me, his eyes wide. "Hear what?" "The breathing." There was a silence, thick and oppressive, and then it came again. Faint, but unmistakable. The slow, deliberate sound of something breathing in the darkness. The breathing was faint at first, almost imperceptible against the hum that filled the chamber. But once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. It was slow, deliberate, like something massive was just beyond the reach of the light, waiting, watching. My pulse quickened, the blood pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, some trick of the mind playing off the stress of being trapped. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The others had stopped moving, their eyes darting nervously around the room. They heard it too now. John, who had been leading us further into the chamber, paused, his hand tightening around the flashlight that barely cut through the thickening darkness. The beam of light flickered. Just once. And we all flinched, instinctively stepping closer to each other, like we were a herd of animals bracing against a predator we couldn't see. No one spoke, but the silence was worse. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of something else, something that shouldn't be there. The breathing grew louder, more rhythmic, echoing off the stone walls, but it still wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around us, as if the room itself had come alive, inhaling and exhaling in slow, measured breaths, the kind of breath that comes before a strike. John turned to us, his face pale but composed. "We need to keep moving," he whispered, but his voice betrayed him. There was fear in it now, fear that he couldn't hide anymore. No one argued. We didn't need to be told twice. Every instinct screamed at us to get away from whatever was lurking in the shadows, but the problem was, we didn't know where to go. The passage we'd come through had vanished, and the room felt like it was stretching, shifting under our feet. Every step we took seemed to pull us deeper into the labyrinth, further from any hope of escape. We moved quickly now, huddled together, our footsteps echoing too loudly in the suffocating silence. The breathing never stopped. It followed us, growing louder, closer, as if whatever was making it was just out of reach, stalking us through the endless corridors. The hum was still there too, vibrating through the walls, through our bones, like a pulse beneath the surface of the stone. But it was different now, darker, more ominous. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like a presence, like the room itself was alive, reacting to us, pulling us in. At some point we reached another chamber, though it felt more like the room had moved around us rather than the other way around. This one was larger than the last, its walls curved inward, pressing down on us from above. The air here was even colder, thick with that metallic scent that burned at the back of my throat. There were no carvings on the walls, no symbols like before, just smooth, cold stone that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. "Where the hell are we?" Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. None of us had an answer. This place wasn't part of any ruin, any civilization we had ever studied. It was something else entirely, something ancient and forgotten. Or maybe something that had never been meant to be found at all. Sarah had been quiet for a while, too quiet. I turned to check on her, and that's when I saw the look on her face. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something behind me. The color had drained from her skin, and her lips were trembling as she mouthed something I couldn't hear over the sound of my own pounding heart. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to turn around, not to see what she was staring at. But I did. At first there was nothing, just the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape, barely visible in the shadows, shifting in and out of the light, like it wasn't entirely there. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was wrong. Its form flickered, distorting in ways that hurt to look at, like reality itself was bending around it. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't move. None of us could. The thing didn't move either. It just stood there, watching, waiting, its form twitching and flickering in the dim light, the breathing, that slow, deliberate breathing, was coming from it, though it didn't have a mouth. Not that I could see, anyway. It was like it wasn't fully formed, like it was still trying to become something. "Ah, we need to go," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hand gripped my arm so tightly it hurt, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My legs felt like they had turned to stone, locked in place by some unseen force. John was the first to break the paralysis. He grabbed my shoulder, snapping me out of the trance, and motioned for us to move. Slowly we backed away from the thing, never turning our backs, never blinking. It didn't follow us. It just stood there, flickering in the darkness, its form shifting like it was caught between dimensions. As we retreated into the corridor behind us, the breathing faded, replaced once again by the low hum that vibrated through the stone. But the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew worse. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air growing thicker, harder to breathe. The cold gnawed at my skin, and my heart raced faster than ever before. We were deep in now, too deep to turn back. I don't know how long we walked after that. Time had lost all meaning in this place. Hours could have passed, or maybe only minutes. The corridors twisted and stretched in impossible ways, leading us deeper into the labyrinth, deeper into whatever nightmare we had stumbled upon. The further we went, the more the walls seemed to change, curving and warping in ways that defied physics, bending the space around us until we could no longer tell which way was up. And all the while the hum grew louder. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, a force pressing against our minds, pushing us forward, deeper into the heart of the structure. The others felt it too. I could see it in their faces, the fear, the desperation. But none of us spoke. We just kept moving, because what else could we do? Eventually, we reached another chamber. This one was different from the others, larger, darker, and at the center something else. Something far worse than what we had seen before. It shimmered, flickering like the thing in the corridor. But it wasn't a figure. It was a gateway. A portal of some kind. It pulsed with a cold, unnatural light, casting eerie shadows across the stone walls. The air around it felt wrong, heavy with something I couldn't explain. And as we stood there, staring at it, I realized with a sinking feeling in my chest. This was what we had been led to. This was what had been waiting for us. The room felt impossibly large, much larger than it had any right to be. The gateway at the center pulsed, sending faint ripples of light across the floor. But it wasn't light that warmed you. It was cold, A kind of cold that you didn't feel on your skin, but deep in your bones. It was as if the very air around it was wrong, like it didn't belong here, didn't belong anywhere we understood. We all stood there staring at it, frozen. No one dared move closer, but at the same time, no one could look away. The light from the portal flickered, and I realized it wasn't flickering at random. There was a rhythm to it, a slow, steady pulse, like a heartbeat. The same rhythm we had been hearing in the hum that had followed us from the moment we entered this place. It wasn't a machine. It was something else, something alive. Marcus was the first to speak, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. "What the hell is that?" His words hung in the air unanswered because none of us had an explanation. It wasn't a question anyone could answer. John, still trying to hold on to some semblance of control, stepped forward, cautiously. "We need to document this," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. There was fear in it now, raw and unfiltered. I could see it in his eyes. He didn't want to get any closer, but he felt like he had to. As he approached the gateway, the hum grew louder. It was almost deafening now, vibrating through the stone, through the air, through us. It felt like the room was shrinking, closing in on us. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath growing shallow. My whole body screamed at me to turn and run, to get as far away from that thing as possible, but my feet wouldn't move. John reached out, his hand trembling as he brought it closer to the gateway. The light around it pulsed faster, reacting to his presence as if it recognized him, as if it was waiting for him. For a moment, I thought he was going to touch it. The air crackled with tension, a kind of static electricity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Every instinct told me that if he touched it, something terrible would happen. "Don't," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the thick silence. But it was too late. His hand made contact. For a split second, nothing happened. He stood there, his hand resting against the shimmering surface of the gateway, his face tight with concentration, as if he was trying to understand what he was feeling. And then, all at once, the room exploded with light. It wasn't just the light that changed. The entire space warped, twisting and bending around us, pulling us into the distortion. The walls, the floor, even the air itself seemed to ripple and shift, like we had been dropped into the center of a storm. The hum turned into a roar, a deafening sound that vibrated through every cell in my body. I stumbled backward, my hands instinctively flying to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just external. It was inside me, shaking my bones, tearing at my mind. John screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the roar. His body jerked violently, his hand still pressed against the gateway, as if something on the other side was pulling him in. His skin paled, his veins bulging as the light from the portal pulsed faster and faster, feeding off of him. He tried to pull away, but his hand was stuck, fused to the surface, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the panic, as he realized he couldn't escape. Marcus rushed forward, trying to pull him back, but the moment he touched John, the same force grabbed hold of him, yanking him toward the gateway. The light wrapped around both of them now, pulsating wildly, twisting their forms, distorting them into shapes that no longer resembled anything human. I couldn't look away, even as my stomach churned with horror. Their bodies flickered in and out of existence, like they were being rewritten, torn apart, and put back together in ways that made no sense. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The light vanished. The hum died, and the room fell silent. John and Marcus were gone. The space where they had stood was empty, the gateway still shimmering faintly, but they were nowhere to be seen. No trace of them, no bodies, no blood. Nothing. It was as if they had never been there at all. I stumbled back, my legs giving way beneath me, collapsing to the cold stone floor. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest heaving as I tried to process what had just happened. But there was no processing it. My mind refused to accept it, refused to understand. Sarah and the others were in shock, frozen in place, their faces pale with terror. No one spoke. No one moved. We were trapped, not just physically, but mentally. The enormity of what we had seen, the impossibility of it, was too much for any of us to handle. "We have to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." But I didn't respond. None of us did, because deep down, we knew there was no way out. The room was still. The light from the gateway had dimmed, but it hadn't disappeared. It flickered faintly like a dying flame, casting long, twisted shadows across the stone walls. But the hum was gone, and with it, the sense of being watched had faded. Whatever had been there before, whatever had taken John and Marcus, was gone, for now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. The silence pressed in on us, heavy and suffocating. But we didn't move. We couldn't. Our minds were trapped in that moment, frozen by the horror of what we had just witnessed. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the room began to shift again. It was subtle at first, just a faint vibration in the floor, but it grew stronger, more insistent. The walls trembled, the air thickening with that same oppressive weight that had been there before, and then the hum returned. It was different this time, though, quieter, more deliberate. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence. Something was coming. Something was waking up. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin, but I didn't shake her off. We had to move. We had to get away from the gateway, from whatever was waiting on the other side. But as we turned to leave, the room shifted again. The walls curved inward, closing off the passage we had come through, trapping us in the chamber with the gateway. The air grew colder, the light dimming even further until it was almost pitch black. And then, from the darkness, I saw it. A shadow, barely visible but unmistakable. It flickered at the edge of the light, its form shifting and distorting like the thing we had seen earlier in the corridor. But this one was bigger, much bigger. It stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if it was testing the boundaries of the space. Its form twisted in the darkness, changing with each step, becoming something more solid, more real. And as it approached, I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me with its presence. We were no longer alone. The shadow stepped closer, its form flickering and shifting like it was struggling to exist in our reality. It moved with an eerie, deliberate slowness, as though it was in no rush. It knew we weren't going anywhere. The room seemed to react to it. Darkness gathered at its feet, swallowing up the faint light that still lingered around the gateway. The air grew thicker with every second, a palpable pressure that weighed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. We backed away instinctively, though there was nowhere to go. The walls had sealed us in, trapping us with this thing, and no matter how much I wanted to run, my legs felt like lead. Sarah was gripping my arm so tightly now, I could feel her shaking. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow. It was more than just darkness. It was something far older, far worse than anything I'd ever imagined. The hum returned, low and vibrating through the floor, through the air, through us. But now it was synchronized with the creature, matching its slow, measured steps. Each pulse sent a shiver down my spine, as if the sound was trying to crawl inside me, trying to turn my own body against me. The others could feel it too. I could see it in their faces, the same dawning horror that we were trapped in something far beyond our understanding. The thing wasn't human. That much was clear. Its shape was too fluid, too distorted, but now I could see glimpses of something worse. A face, or maybe several faces, flickering in and out of the dark mass, like it was borrowing bits and pieces of people it had consumed. Eyes appeared and vanished, mouths stretched open in silent screams, and hands. I saw hands clawing at the air, reaching out, but they weren't solid. They weren't fully formed. It was like the creature was still trying to decide what shape it wanted to take. And then it spoke. At least that's what it felt like. The sound didn't come from the creature itself, but from the walls, from the very air around us. It wasn't a voice in any language I understood. It was more like a feeling, an oppressive, suffocating pressure that pushed down on my mind, filling my head with thoughts that weren't my own. Images flashed before my eyes, fleeting glimpses of things I couldn't comprehend, alien landscapes, endless voids, and shapes that didn't belong to any world I knew. I couldn't understand them, but I knew they were wrong. I knew they weren't meant for me, for us. I staggered backward, clutching my head, trying to block out the intrusion, but it was no use. The thing was inside me now, inside all of us. I could feel it probing, searching for something it needed. It was in our minds, and it was pulling us apart bit by bit. Sarah collapsed beside me, her hands pressed to her ears as if she could block it out. But I knew it wouldn't help. I could hear the others too, soft gasps, whimpers, their own struggles to resist whatever this thing was doing to us. It wasn't just physical anymore. This was something else, something far worse. And then I felt it, a pull, like gravity, but not on my body, on my mind. It was dragging me, pulling me toward the gateway, toward the shimmering light that still pulsed weakly at the center of the room. I tried to resist, planting my feet, but it didn't matter. The pull wasn't physical. It was in my head, yanking at my thoughts, twisting my perception, distorting reality itself. I stumbled forward, my body betraying me, moving against my will. I wasn't alone. Sarah and the others were being pulled too, their bodies moving in jerky, unnatural motions toward the gateway. The creature stayed where it was, watching us, flickering in and out of sight like it was feeding off our fear. The closer I got to the gateway, the more the light from it seemed to warp. It wasn't just flickering anymore. It was shifting like the portal was reacting to us, to the creature. The light grew darker, turning from cold white to a sickly green, and then to something blacker than the shadows themselves. It wasn't a gateway anymore. It was a hole, a tear in reality itself, leading somewhere I didn't want to go. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but my body kept moving and dragged closer and closer to that horrible yawning void. I could feel it now, the pull of whatever was on the other side, like it was trying to consume me, trying to pull me through and erase me from existence. And then, just as I reached the edge of the gateway, the creature moved. It stepped forward, its form solidifying for the first time, taking on a shape that almost looked human. But it wasn't. Its face was twisted wrong, its eyes too large, too dark, and its mouth was too wide, stretching across its face in a grin that didn't belong. It reached out with one of its distorted hands, fingers long and thin, almost skeletal, and touched the edge of the gateway. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was deathly silent, the hum gone, the pull on my mind loosening just slightly. But then the gateway responded. The blackness deepened, swirling around the creature's hand, and I could see its form start to dissolve, its body melting into the darkness, being pulled into the void. But it didn't struggle, it didn't resist. It wanted to go. It had lured us here for this, for whatever waited on the other side. As the creature began to disappear into the gateway, its eyes locked onto mine. I felt a chill run through me, deeper than anything I had ever felt. And then, in my mind, I heard a voice again. Clearer this time. "You don't belong here." The words echoed in my head, reverberating through my skull. But they weren't a threat. They were a warning. And then it was gone. The creature, the gateway, everything. The light blinked out, leaving us in complete darkness. For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The air was still, heavy with the weight of what we had just experienced. I could hear Sarah sobbing quietly beside me, her body trembling with fear, and I realized that I was shaking too. My hands were cold, my heart still racing, and my mind felt raw, like it had been torn open and stitched back together wrong. But it was over. Or at least it seemed like it was. The walls hadn't shifted back. The entrance was still gone. And we were still trapped. But the presence was gone. The hum had died. Whatever it was, whatever had been watching us, had left. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, my voice hoarse. It sounded weak in the oppressive darkness, but it was all I could manage. We stumbled through the darkness, no longer caring about the endless corridors or the shifting walls. We just moved, desperate to get as far away from that place as possible. But the way out didn't reveal itself. There was no exit, just more stone, more darkness, more of the same unyielding nightmare. And then, after what felt like hours of wandering, we reached it, the doorway. It was there, standing open, just as it had been when we first entered. But something was different now. The air around it was thick, heavy with a sense of finality. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones. This was it, our last chance to leave. I stepped through first, my breath catching as the cold desert air hit my face. The others followed, one by one, until we were all standing outside again, beneath the vast, empty sky. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand, and for a moment I thought we were safe, that we had escaped. But as we looked back at the structure, at the doorway we had just stepped through, I saw it. The faint flicker of light, deep within the shadows, and I knew then, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that we hadn't escaped at all. We had only just begun.